Hi, I'm Jim Zogby, and welcome to Viewpoint. It's been a year since the Saudi-led coalition began launching airstrikes on Yemen. In retaliation, they said, for Yemen's president being ousted from power. Joining me now to discuss the status of the conflict is Barbara Bodine, a distinguished professor in the practice of diplomacy and director of the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. During her 30-plus years in foreign service, she focused primarily on the Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf countries, served as U.S. ambassador to the Republic of Yemen from 1997 to 2001. Thank you.
My pleasure. Nice to see you again.
So it's been a year since the Saudis began their attacks on Yemen. To restore President Hadi to power, here's what I want to do. I want to look at where we are. There's a New York Times headline, which I'm going to put up on the screen, and hinting that, as I said, let's put it up on the screen so we can take a look at it, that says hints of an end to the fighting in Yemen. And then it goes on to describe it. I want to talk about where we are right now. Then I want to go back for our viewers who don't know the history or where we are. And then I want to go forward to see what can actually come of all of this. First, with regard to the hints of an end to the fighting, there are some very specific timetables mentioned here. A ceasefire on the 10th of April, and the 18th negotiations begin apparently in Kuwait. Are you optimistic, or are you just ho-hum about this?
This is the first positive sign that we've seen. Just before the announcement by the UN of the ceasefire and then the talks in Kuwait, there was a mini agreement between Saudi Arabia and Houthi negotiators just along the border with Sada, just between Saudi Arabia and Yemen. And it was a very limited ceasefire in terms of geography. It included a prisoner swap, which is kind of confidence building measures 101, and a rather odd Facebook statement by one of the Houthi leaders asking Iran to no longer meddle in Yemeni affairs. And that was kind of our first hint because the Saudi-Sada border is the most critical to the Saudis. And a prisoner swap is always a good sign. It was followed relatively shortly thereafter by this announcement of a broader ceasefire and broader talks in Kuwait. And so those of us who have been watching this is the closest thing to something positive. The previous ceasefires were almost imposed by the UN, and they were always driven by the humanitarian crisis, and they never held. This one seems to have more politics behind it. It seems to have the Saudis behind it, and it seems to have the Houthis, and probably by extension the Iranians behind it.
One other very recent development that I'd like you to comment on before we go backwards is the announcement that came from President Hadi
yesterday,
of deposing his vice president and replacing him with General Ali Mohsen al-Ahmar. Several ways of looking at that. One of them is that it was a Saudi slap at the Emirates, but also that it's because, for reasons that maybe you can tell us about. The other is that, well, was it a smart move? Tell me that. Was this a smart move, and is it, does it spell something positive for the future, or do you think that it's going to be a problem in the negotiations? Because he is a very hard line on the Houthi.
Right. Yeah. It's, I didn't see this as a positive step. A couple of weeks ago, President Hadi brought Ali Mohsen back into the government as kind of political advisor, Minister of Defense. And that was a very disturbing development because, as you said, Ali Mohsen is extremely hardline. He is the one who led the military campaign under Saleh to try to defeat the Houthi. I would point out that he was not successful. And so was this an effort to kind of bring Ali Mohsen and those military units that are still loyal to him more on the fight for Hadi. Okay, I can almost understand that. This dismissal of Baha is...
The current Prime Minister, Vice President.
The current Prime Minister, Vice President, or at least up until yesterday, is disturbing because he brought in Ali Mohsen not only as Vice President, but he brought in somebody who, to be honest, very few people have ever heard of, to be the Prime Minister. So he took those two jobs and he split them. And the new Prime Minister is a member of the main party, the General People's Congress, Ali Abdullah's party, but a very hardliner. So he's brought in two very heavy hardliners. One is a politician of no particular note. The other is a general of no particular military victories, but both politically very hardliner. And more importantly, Khalid Baha was a technocrat, or is a very well-respected technocrat. He is not from the north or the south. He's from the Hadramaut, so it made him kind of a neutral party. He had been brought in as prime minister under Houthi pressure a year and a half ago when the Houthis came into Sana'a. So he had connections with the Houthi. He was acceptable to Hadi. He was from the Hadramaut, the three H's. And so there was a lot of expectation that he was going to be a bridge to the next government. It may be that Hadi also saw that he was a bridge to the next government as the vice president. The Yemeni constitution allows the vice president to take the place of the president, which is how Hadi came to power. So is this Hadi just trying to neutralize a successor, or is this Hadi signaling a very hard line? Baha was known to be more sympathetic to coming up with a political solution. He had connections with the Houthi. There are reports that the Saudis actually would like to get to a political accommodation, and this Sada border pre-agreement kind of signaled that. And so how does this fit in with the Saudi?
Yeah.
And we also know that the Emiratis very much would like a political solution.
And they're close to Baha.
And they're close to Baha, but so are the Saudis.
Yeah.
And as a Hadrami from the Hadramaut, he was neutral in terms of this north-south
Let's
business.
just do the following. It's really difficult to go back because
where do you go back to?
There are conflicts within conflicts within conflicts. It's difficult to sort of peel off the layers of the onion.
Right.
But if we start with the Arab Spring,
okay.
With the beginning of turmoil in the country, through as a way to resolve some of the conflict, the Gulf countries coming in and creating a compromise that brought Hadi to power in the first place.
Right.
Take us from there to the beginning of the conflict and how we got to here.
Right. In the beginning, it looked as if, Yemen did fall into the protests and the demonstrations of the Arab Spring. But unlike some other countries, they actually negotiated a settlement. They negotiated Ali Abdullah out of power. They negotiated Hadi coming in. The GCC agreement allowed all of that to happen. And there was some thought that Yemen was going to make it through the Arab Spring. The
one thing I would just Ali Abdullah Saleh was ousted from power at that point, but stayed around.
Right.
And he reminded me of the Seinfeld episode with George Costanza, where he gets fired and keeps coming back to work. Yeah,
there is a little bit of that.
Yeah.
The immunity that was given to him was probably necessary for the transition. Whether or not him staying around was a good idea, people are wondering about. I think it's also important to note that at one point, after his mosque was blown up and several of the members of his cabinet were killed, he was in medical treatment in Saudi Arabia, and there was a question about whether or not he would go back to Yemen. And there were people who advised the Saudis to keep him in Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis actually allowed him to go back. And I my guess is they deeply regret that. Saleh is one of the best politicians I've ever met, and it was the idea that you could depose him and he would quietly sit at his house was probably naive. So we have the GCC agreement, we get Saleh out, we get Hadi in. The most significant step was the convening of the National Dialogue Conference. And it was the first one under the Arab Spring. It was remarkably diverse in terms of every component of this incredibly complex country had a seat at the table. Women, youth, Southerners, Houthis were there. Everybody except Al-Qaeda was present. And they fought through and talked through, as Yemenis can do, basically a new social contract. And again, there was a great deal of hope. Where it broke down was, first of all, they came up with a federal system that sort of nobody liked. Everyone liked federalism, nobody liked the lines. More importantly, even though everyone had been involved in the national dialogue and involved in this new social contract, the GCC agreement actually stipulated that, all this notwithstanding, the new political structure would be based on the two previous political parties, the General People's Congress, Saleh's party, and something called the Joint Meeting Party, which was this bizarre amalgam of Islah, which was in itself an amalgam of northern tribes and Muslim Brotherhood, so over here, and the Yemen Socialist Party over here. And basically, by defaulting back to the two pre-existing political parties, you negated the role, the effort, the participation of women, of youth, of Houthis, of Southerners, and there was a bit of this, why did we do this? Mm-hmm. And I think what really fueled the Houthis coming into Sana'a a year later, when the transition had stalled and there were no elections, was we did everything right. We were part of Change Square, we were part of the national dialogue, as were all these other subgroups, and now we're being told that we basically are going back to 2011. We want this process opened up. And you had the National Partnership Plan, maybe might have worked, and then it started to fall apart. And the Houthis, who don't have a governing philosophy or a governing plan or governing experience, were slowly trying to take over the government. January, Baha and Hadi under house arrest. February, they independently managed to get to Aden. And then the Houthis, in a sense, drove south very quickly. I think in some ways the Houthis getting into Aden was a bit like the dog catching the mail truck. They never thought they would move that far, that fast. And all of a sudden the Saudis realized that the Houthis had basically the whole country. But the other very critical piece of this...
But it wasn't the Houthis alone. The Houthis are northern tribes that have...
okay.
They were mostly in the north.
They're northerners. They're not a tribe.
They're in the north, and they had moved south, but they also had President Saleh, the former President Saleh, the forces that were allied with him, also fighting with them. So it wasn't just a band of insurrectionists. It was an insurrectionist with a large chunk of the old army.
Right, which is a very odd combination if you remember that Saleh spent 10 years fighting
trying to kill them.
Trying to kill them, and they trying to kill him. Yeah. And all of a sudden these two are together and they're pushing south for their own particular reasons, not liking the Hadi government. The other big piece, though, is in the middle of all of this, at the time Hadi and Baha were under house arrest, King Abdullah died. Mm-hmm. And I do remember being with some people who, we were talking about Yemen when it happened and going, this is the very worst time for King Abdullah to die. We then had a Saudi succession. We had King Salman come in, who's much more hardline than Abdullah. And then soon his son is brought in as the deputy crown prince. This 30-year-old with no military experience becomes a defense minister. And that's when the Saudis decided that they weren't going to stand for this, and you had this military engagement. The other piece of this very complex puzzle is the U.S.-Iranian nuclear deal. And President Obama, when he announced it in the Rose Garden, said, we have guaranteed to the Saudis, their security, and we will be there for them. Well, the Saudis basically came to us and said, this is our major security concern. We're going in. Are you with us or against us? And so you had this witch's brew of what probably would have been a civil war anyway. I don't want to sort of say the Saudis are fully responsible for the violence. It was a civil war that probably would have worked itself out in Yemen. The Saudis coming in with major airstrikes, major military, completely shifted the topography of this conflict and changed it in a way that now it's an international issue on how you walk it back.
The Iranians didn't help by making some claims that we now have our people said, the head of the Al-Quds brigade,
Right.
We now have our people in 4 capitals,
Right.
Beirut, Sana'a, Damascus, and Baghdad. And,
Absolutely.
That got the Saudis nervous, and they give their reasons for going in that, number one, they felt betrayed by the U.S., that the U.S., as they put it, I asked
Right.
Another guest about this question once, and that was, they said the U.S. is reconciling with Iran
Right.
and betraying us and leaving us out.
Right.
That was insecurity, and then there
Right.
was this sense that the Iranians are using Yemen as the southern, a way that threatens the Saudis from the south, when
Right.
they're already being threatened from the north in Syria and Iraq. Play that out. Is that a legitimate concern? Number one, that they've been abandoned by the U.S., and number two, that the Iranians are threatening them from all sides.
Yeah. First, there is some legitimacy, but I think it's overwrought. I don't think the United States is abandoning Saudi Arabia. I don't think the United States is abandoning the Gulf. To quote another one of your guests, it's not a zero-sum game. And we have worked with both the Saudis and the Iranians going all the way back to the Twin Pillar program of the 70s. So this idea that, we are fully integrating Iran into, our relationships is overstated. The idea that we're abandoning the Saudis is grotesquely overstated.
Have we handled it well?
I think we have handled it as well as we could. We have repeatedly assured them. We had a summit here. We are continuing to provide them military equipment. We have done everything. The Saudis, I think, their real concern is not so much that we abandon them, but that they are being, they have a real competitor in Iran, not military, but a political competitor. The Saudi legitimacy is rooted in their role as the custodian of the 2 holy places, and that they are basically the arbiters of what is a good Islamic government. The Iranians have an alternative model, and it's one that actually has not caught on in the Middle East. But anything that makes it look as if Iran is an alternative model to what a good Islamic government can be is a deep, deep threat to them. So this is a political threat. The theology is secondary, the ethnicity is secondary. This is politics. The Iranians understand that. They are not responsible for the Houthis. The Houthis are, the technical academic term is a non-kinship affinity group, which means it's a bunch of guys who got together who aren't related. We're not dependent on Iranian arms, dependent on Iranian assistance or anything else. The Iranians have played this. It suits them politically. What is really important to Iran is Baghdad, Damascus, and Beirut, not Yemen. But to the extent that the Saudis obsess over Yemen and are throwing in excess of $1 billion a month in terms of military equipment, focusing their political and military bandwidth on Yemen, roiling their own domestic politics over Yemen. They're not focused up north. And so if I was an Iranian, I would be delighted that the Saudis are focused on Yemen, because anything that's flying south is not flying north.
Right. Let's look at the impact of this Saudi involvement. It has been felt on many levels. There's a political impact. There's also a humanitarian crisis. Let's look. We have some numbers to put up about the humanitarian crisis, and it's really quite devastating. Let's take a look at them. The number of people killed, and in particular the issue, the impact of children and malnutrition and lack of water. It's astounding.
It's staggering.
And Yemen was a poor country to start with.
Well, and I think that's an important point, is that, if 2010 was a heyday, it was a heyday of a country that was already food insecure, water insecure, fuel insecure, medical insecure. It was on the edge. And what's happened in this last year is that it's just been pushed over the edge. There was no cushion there whatsoever. It's been declared a level 3 humanitarian crisis. There's only 4 of those in the world. This is not something you aspire to. The devastation, the physical damage, infrastructure damage, and Yemen's infrastructure was fairly rudimentary, is, by one estimate, there is as much damage to Yemen in this 1 year as Syria has suffered in 4 or 5 years. The impact on the children is particularly telling, because, okay, they've missed a year of school. You can catch up on that. But if you are malnourished, that affects your physical growth and your cognitive growth. If you're not getting your immunizations, everything, these children are being permanently, physically and intellectually stunted, as well as the death rate has gone up considerably. You have dengue fever, which you never had before. You have malaria. Children, the major cause of infant mortality in Yemen in what was passed for the good old days were diarrheal, waterborne. Well, the water system, to the extent that it existed, has been completely destroyed. So you're talking about, I think the 900 children killed is probably a very low number, but the long-term impact is going to be something that's going to live with Yemen for a generation.
The question is, even if there's a deal,
right?
Remember at the end of the Lebanon war,
right?
There was a Rafiq Hariri,
right?
Who's going to be the Hariri for Yemen? And it's a country that, as you noted, just remarkable historical sites, but no infrastructure to speak of.
Right.
What was missing is now destroyed.
Right.
How does Yemen come back?
Yeah.
And what does it come back to?
Well, I think that's an excellent question, and one that a lot of us are wrestling with. I would note that there has been an enormous amount of damage to the historical sites. The old city, any number of World Heritage UNESCO sites have been destroyed. And you can't put a value on that, and you can't actually rebuild them. You can reconstruct them. The reconstruction of Yemen is estimated to be about $100 billion. And there are no Rafiq Hariris in Yemen. It's going to take, there are a number of major business families in Saudi Arabia who trace their roots to Yemen. The most notorious, of course, are the bin Ladens, or at least one bin Laden. Would some
and the
of...
Al-Amoudis?
Yes.
There's a lot of...
I mean, there's one bad bin Laden, but there's the bin Laden, there's a whole range of very prominent, very wealthy Yemen origin Saudi families which may decide to step up. it's going to take the entire international community to at least get in there. And the first is to get the transportation system, the road network going. Because if you're isolated, whatever else you bring in is moot. And to get the electricity up. Because without electricity, you can't do water, you can't do health, you can't do anything else. So that's going to have to be the first focus, as well as just getting humanitarian supplies in. But Lebanon's population is 7 million?
No, 3.5, 4.
3.5, okay. Yemen's population is about almost 30 million.
Yeah.
So you're talking about a far more rugged country, far more inaccessible. Most of Lebanon is close to the coast. This is going to be far, far more difficult.
Let me ask a couple questions because we're running out of time, but I do want to talk about other impacts. There is an impact on the social fabric of Yemen.
Absolutely.
I want to talk about that. I also want to talk about something that we don't talk about, and that is the impact this has had on Saudi Arabia's regional standing and the passivity of the United States, the impact that that's had on us as well, in terms of perceptions in the region that we were a coat holder, essentially, in this. If I could ask you quickly to just comment on all three.
Oh, well, in terms of
the social fabric of
the social fabric is...
I mean, can they achieve a national dialogue at this point, or is too much water under the bridge?
I think that everyone's hope is that if we can stop this war soon, that, you know, if it's a year, a little bit more than a year, there's, if you want, muscle memory. People who are involved in the national dialogue are still around. You know, can you get this back together? And Lebanon reweaving itself after 15 years, I think, is a optimistic point. The damage to the social fabric is very worrisome. Hopefully, in a year, there's enough time to put it back together again. Go back to the national dialogue as the start point and work forward from there. Don't go back to the GCC, go back to the national dialogue. The cost to Saudi Arabia has been enormous, financial, regional, and I think particularly when this war is over and people can go in and see what happened, there are going to be a lot of questions. There's a lot of questions about the Saudis having violated any number of the laws of war in terms of blocking harbors, using humanitarian assistance as a weapon. You know, there's a lot of stuff that is very worrisome, and I think the Saudis will have to account for that. Our role as coat holders is in the region. We talk about it as the Saudi coalition. In the region, it's called the Saudi American Coalition, and I think we will pay the price for that. There's one other ramification of this, is while you've had this circular firing squad going on, you know, with any number of players, the one player that has come out of this very strong and gaining territory is Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. This is fundamentally not in our interest, not in Saudi Arabia's interest, not in anybody's interest. But as long as this conflict goes on, AQAP has been able to take territory. It has a major port, McCullough. It has most of the coastline all the way to Aden. It has been fighting in Tayyuz on the side of the Saudis and President Hadi. And this has allowed what we consider one of the more dangerous elements of Al-Qaeda to get a territorial position far in excess of what they've ever had. So I can't tell you on any level why this war makes sense or why it's going to come out well. The only real hope is to go back to, hopefully we will have a ceasefire and hopefully we will start a political process.
Thank you so much. We're out of time, but it was
Thank you.
It's an important discussion we don't talk about enough. It's a sort of a war that's off the front pages, and so we don't talk about it.
Yes.
But that's all the time we've got. For information, you can follow us on Twitter at AAIUSA or check out our website at aaiusa.org. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.